I'm eيهاب والى. I'm basically a physical therapist, and I'm lecturer in the pediatric department in the faculty of physical therapy, as well as I'm a gait analyst. And I had a sort of master's degree in the clinical gait analysis from Stanford University in Manchester, United Kingdom. And today I will talk about the issue of the gait analysis. And as you know, if we just try to translate, so we will talk about تحليل المشي. ودور تحليل المشي ممكن يفيدنا احنا في ايه؟ كزملاء او كفريق طبي بيتعامل مع مشاكل مرتبطه كتيره بالديسابيلتي او بالاعاقات اللي بالتاكيد احد اشكالها الاعاقات الحركيه ومشاكل المشي بشكل عام. So this is the sort of references if you need to go for a further reading regarding this issue of the clinical gait analysis in general. Either we are talking about the children as well as the adults. You can go for the Gen Gauge identification and treatment of the gait problems and cerebral palsy. Either you can go for the Jacqueline jury related to the gait analysis, normal and pathological function, and another text about the gait analysis for Mitchell Whittle, and finally for the Freeman Miller regarding the cerebral palsy. Majority of the pioneers talking about the clinical gait analysis. I think صوتي متهيألي تمام الناس سامعة؟ مش سامعين كويس. كده بس ما يبقاش فيه إزعاج شوية. Majority of the pioneers leading in the issue of the clinical gait analysis are mainly either to be an orthopedic surgeons, especially those dedicated to deal with the children with a sort of disability, mainly the cerebral palsy, and to some extent the other disciplines like the physiotherapist or physiatrist or the biomedical engineering and so on. A little bit historical point of view, if we are back to the Inman, who is one of the pioneers about the gait analysis almost in 40s or 50s. At that time, he said that it's obvious that any improvement, either in the surgical and physiotherapeutic procedures or even in the using of the assistive devices and braces, must rest upon an accurate knowledge of the functional characteristics of the normal locomotor system. So before going to talk about the impact of the clinical gait analysis on the management, we need a little bit to go for a hint about the normal walking pattern, and to which extent do we have to know the standard as much as we can, so in turn we can catch any sort of deviation for any of your patients. So what do you think about the clinical gait analysis once you hear this term? In your mind we can get many of the titles. So we can talk about it as a sort of instrumental measuring in your assessment. We can say that this is a sort of an objective measures about the walking. We can talk about it from the clinical point of view. We can say that it has a sort of reliability, validity, accuracy, as well as repeatability. And finally, definite, it helps in the issue of the decision making. Define the clinical gait analysis in a brief term as an objective way to analyze how your patient is assumed is walking better, and to a certain extent to know about that exactly. So we need a little bit to have a background from the biomechanical point of view. We need to have a little bit basic knowledge about the anatomy, about the neurophysiology, about the musculoskeletal system, so we can proceed for interpretation of this kind of data. You can address the clinical gait analysis from different perspectives. So, as we are in the medical community, so the WHO is our reference. So, if we assume the ICF model, I don't know if you are familiar with it or not, but you know, as the WHO defines a disability now, they have this sort of modeling to identify the issue of the disability and the health problem. It's an abbreviation for International Classification of Function, Disability and Performance and Function. So at that time, I don't like to use them. صوتي شوية يقدر يجيب يعني. So previously they defined the disability as a sort of impairment. خلينا نقول هي بالعربي العجز. لو احنا كنا بنتكلم في الثمانينات زي مثلا، يبقى منظمة الصحة العالمية كانت بتعرف الإعاقة ازاي؟ إن أنت عندك مريض عنده درجة معينة من العجز. Later on, with the other sort of brainstorming and many of the evidence base and researches and like that, they started to make a revolution for these terms, and they had now a sort of new term or the new kind of definition for disability. So we will not just concern with the impairment. مش هنهتم فقط بالعجز، ولكن هنبدأ نشوف فاكتورز تانية مهمة لازم نراعيها مع المرضى بتوعنا. أهمهم what about the participation that the patient can assume, or what the kind of the participation restriction that you can face with your patient. يبقى بدأنا نندمج في مسميات أخرى أو في معاني أخرى مرتبطة بتفاعلي أنا مع المجتمع، الأنشطة الحركية اللي أنا ما بقدرش أعملها واللي أنا بقدر أعملها، وفي نهاية المطاف خالص we will talk about the impairment. So based on the ICF model related to the WHO, we can go for the same procedure when we talk about the clinical gait analysis. So if you are catch the clinical gait analysis from this perspective, now you are focused on the main impairment, the main pathology, which reflect over this sort of deviation from the normal gait. So at that time, you are a little bit thinking about the gait analysis from the concept of that, what is the impairment. On the other side, مش كل أشكال العجز أو الامبيرمنت أو الباثولوجي نقدر إن احنا نحلها طبيا بشكل عام, whatever we are a physio, physicians, surgeons, and so on. So to some extent, now you need to understand how your patient cope with this kind of impairment and pathology. لو ادينا مثال مبسط جدا, لو في أي حد بيشتكي من خشونة فرضا في ركبته اليمين, بالطبيعة من غير ما أي حد يوجهه هيبدأ يعمل more weight bearing on the other side. فأنا بالتالي كواحد متخصص أقدر ألاحظ إن المريض بتاعي now he has a sort of shifting of his weight. So to some extent, may I can find that the trunk is a lean sideway. May I have a sort of pelvic obliquity. To some extent, may I can find a slight knee flexion. So at that time, I will not say by anyhow that the pathology, including trunk leaning or pelvic obliquity or knee flexion, because in a simple way, this is a compensatory mechanism. So the other concept that you have to think about when we talk about the clinical gait analysis, how your patient cope with the pathology, how your patient compensate the main impairment and start to deal with that. And I think this is one of the main points, especially for us as a physios, we need to understand very well. Because if you try to deal with the compensatory mechanism, now the outcome measure will be totally negative. ما ينفعش ان انا اعالج الطرق اللي المريض بيحاول ان هو يعادل فيها المشكله اللي عنده واحاول اصححها من غير ما اهتم بالمشكله الرئيسيه. So this is the second concept you have to think about it if we are talking about the clinical gait analysis. The third point, if you and your medical team need to judge in an efficient, objective way about the procedures that you are decided to do. أنا دلوقتي هأقر شيء أنا عايز أعمله either في التمرينة بتاعتي, في الأورثوزس, في البريسز, في السيرجري, في الميديكيشن and so on. How to judge? Is it efficient or not? One of the main problems that we are facing in this community that we just judge about the improvement in a narrative way. هو اتحسن. What does it mean اتحسن? مشيته بقت أفضل. يعني إيه مشيته بقت أفضل? This is not in the context of the medical sector. We can debate in that in chatting in the cafe, but this is not among the medical community. So if we need to respect what we are going to do, so you need to judge from the measurement, both of or the post therapy or post using of any kind of modalities that you are using in your therapy. So here you have many concepts during your thinking about the clinical gait analysis. And we still figure out about the normal gait. So we can say that the gait is a cycle. It's a sort of repetitive movement that we are assuming to transfer from point A to point B. In this way, we are assuming this kind of mobility and locomotion over bipedal activity. Otherwise, we can transfer by rolling over, crawling, creeping, and so on. So if you catch one of the gait cycle, this is a totally representable about the normal default pattern of walking for your patient. Analysis in a simple way can define by the Wikipedia as a sort of breakdown of the task. So if I have now a sort of multitask through the gait cycle, I need to break it down into small clusters. And then I start to analyze each tiny part of that to catch the whole data that I need. What are the main parameters or main titles, let's say, that we can catch from the clinical gait measuring? We can measure what's called the temporospatial parameter, which is related to the time issue, like that step time, speed, cadence, and so on. Other term related to the distance, so I can judge about the step length, to which extent my step is long or short, to which extent my base of support is wide or narrow, and all of these criteria related to the distance. The second term is the kinematic, and kinematic in a simple way could be defined as to which extent you can describe, let's say, how your joints and your segment is moving during any of the tasks. So if I'm talking about reaching, let's say, and now I'm going to describe how my shoulder girdle is moving in space. So either to talk about joint or talk about segment like the arm or the forearm. It's the same scenario for the lower extremity during the gait. So as you are trying now to find what we call the trajectory of the joint, المدى الحركي بشكل عام لكل مفصل ازاي بيتحرك اثناء المشي. So we need to know the norm for that, and then you can catch any sort of deviation. However, imagine now that I have this solid segment like the table, and I need to move this table from this point to another point. This table is a solid segment, so I need to exert an external force to move it from 1 to 2. For us, we need the same to move, so we need forces. And the forces needed to allow movement or to allow walking has two kinds. Either to be internal forces coming from your muscle firing or muscle activity, as well as to some extent the ligament support. Either to be an external forces coming from the gravity, from the ground reaction force, and to some extent coming from the inertia. So you need to understand well how the forces are applying or influence over the gait pattern. The last term is related to the dynamic electromyography or dynamic EMG, and this is concerned with how can we describe and analyze the behavior of each group of muscles during the walking. So to which extent now the rectus femoris is active or passive during the gait cycle? What about the soleus? What about the gastrocnemius? And all of that. So this is the main parameters that we can catch from the clinical gait analysis. So here this is an example about the spatiotemporal parameter, and I think in the undergraduate usually you passed over that. Kinematic and kinetic as we mentioned, and now we need a little bit to know if you have a patient, either child or adult, going to move and start walking, what are the main variables that you need to observe very well to scan about to which extent your patient is similar to the norm or deviated from that. We have many theories related to the main variables responsible about the efficient gait pattern, and the most recent one of them Jacqueline Berry, one of them, it was a little bit old, it was in 80s, and she talked that here we have 4 main points we need to judge usually about it for the efficient walking. We need to judge about the propulsion, your capability to, let's say, fly your limb in the swing, stability in stance, shock absorption, and energy consumption. Later, almost 10 years more or later for that, Jen Gage, one of the pioneers in the gait analysis mainly for cerebral palsy, identified that the main variables we need to judge about it are stability in stance, so they are similar in the same point, clearance in swing, reposition of the foot, adequate step length, and the energy consumption. Lately, Richard Baker, one of another pioneer from the perspective of the biomedical engineer, started to talk about this another 5 parameters. So in general, we can say that if you need to walk, and we are transferring from this point to another point, we are in a situation of mobility now. However, we need to secure our center of mass, or let's say our weight, during the walking. Otherwise, if the center of mass is shifting out of the base of support, you will collapse, so you will fall down. So during walking, we need 2 main parameters all the time. I need a mobility, as well as that I need stability. So I need to support my body weight during the stance. The stance is a period of time that in which my foot in a contact with the ground. While I need proper clearance, I need to clear the limb in swing. And I need proper step length, because if I have a short step length, or I have excessive long step length in both situations, now I have a abnormality. I need a smooth transition, so by this way I am transferring my center of mass in a very smooth way, and I don't need too much muscle forces to redirect the center of mass within the base of support. And finally, all of that should serve the amount of energy expenditure I need. هل حضراتكم تقدروا تتوقعوا لو مشينا بسرعتنا العادية لمدة ساعة من الزمن نقدر نحرق كام كالوريز؟ If you are walking for 1 hour with your normal default pattern, almost you are burning around 1 spoon of sugar. Okay? So that means I'm not working in the weight reduction, okay, or the obesity. Okay, but that means that we need to understand why. What is the mechanism for that? It's a bit debated, has many theories, but if you are interested to understand that, you have to back to something called that during our walking we have 2 kinds of pendulum during the walk. You know the pendulum for the clock, for the watch? Usually we assume 2 kinds of pendulum. Simple pendulum during the swing, when my foot is fly. So this is a simple pendulum. Okay, here is the pivot, and over the foot this is the weight. And during stance I have inverted pendulum. So the pivot represents the foot, and here is the mass. So we are moving like that. This is an example for the inverted pendulum. So as we have these 2 kinds of pendulum, we are transferring all the time our energy from something called potential energy to the kinetic energy. كنا بناخدها زمان في الثانوي، طاقة وضع وطاقة حركة. تمام؟ يبقى إذا طول الوقت واحنا بنمشي احنا بنغير طاقة الوضع بتاعتنا إلى طاقة حركة، إلى طاقة وضع، إلى طاقة حركة، فبالتالي we don't need too much build up of the new energy. علشان كده احنا مش بنحرق كالوريز كتيرة واحنا بنمشي. But if you have a disabled patient, if you have a patient with any sort of abnormality, he has a disturbance in this phenomenon. So they have to exert much more forces, okay, to really go or recalling, let's say, the center of mass within the base of support. So مش غريب ان احنا نبدا نسمع منهم ان بعد 5-6 مرات في التمارين في الباري البارسي مثلا احنا تعبنا. So they are not claiming. يعني مش بيدعوا دايما ان هم بيتعبوا. We have to understand that they need to exert much more energy for that. And you need to understand how to reduce as much as you can this kind of deviation and in turn the energy expenditure. So this picture, for example, this is a girl and she starts to assume walking, and at the left side now in a swing, she's using a stick, and you can see to which extent now the stable limb assuming the knee flexion. So if you have a knee flexion during the stance, definitely now you have a problem in your stability. And she has more demanding now over the muscles acting over the knee joint. So she exerting too much energy to keep herself stable at that time. The same if we have any sort of weakness, mainly for the hip abductors, so we will find that the patient start to lean to one side to really create the line of gravity among or inside the joint, so there is no need to exert a muscle effort. So back to the slides we said in the beginning, this is considered as a sort of compensatory mechanism. And if you need now your patient to realign the trunk in the neutral position, he will not be able to walk. So you need to understand that very well. So before going to cancel the compensatory mechanism, you need to activate much more the hip abductors at that time. Otherwise, he will not have any sort of compensatory mechanism to hold. For the sequence of gait, as you know, this is the stance and this is the swing. So if we imagine this is the left side and this is the right side, for each of the gait cycle, during the stance in which the foot on the ground, we have 2 times of double support. So in which both feet in a contact with the floor. Why we need that? Because we need stability also. So if your patient has any disturbance at that amount of time regarding the double support time, so this is an indication that he has a sort of lack of stability, and you need to address that very well. We have many theories to classify the gait cycle into many of the subphases. Jacqueline Berry, one of the very famous for that, like started with the initial contact, loading response, mid stance, terminal stance, and all of that. There is no time to go for a debate about the critique for that, but this is one of the new classification for the gait cycle, and we can define it as a subphases, including first double support. At the end of stance, we have a second double support, and in between, we have a single support time, which divided into 3 equal parts: early, single support, middle, and late, which corresponding exactly to the timing of the swing, which also represent 40% of the gait cycle. If we talk a little bit about the kinematic, just to understand this subphase of the gait cycle, so here we are talking about the first double support time. Once you are landing on the floor, so you need to know exactly how your hip, knee, ankle, foot, pelvis are behave in the normal way. So this is the graphs represented the norm for the kinematic, and as we mentioned kinematic, so you are concerning now with the range of motion for each of these joints. So this is the hip flexion extension, and you understand that during the beginning of the gait cycle, the hip joint assume a flexion almost around 35 degrees. So at that time, we are talking about the first double support time. Here, if you need to observe the moment, the force is acting over the hip joint at that time, and finally, to which extent the power generation we need at that time in the normal walking. We don't have enough time to proceed in the details about that, but you have to organize your mind if you need to understand very well the normal gait to go from the kinematic joint range of motion, the forces acting over the joint, and the level of power generation should be done at that time for the proper walking. The same scenario for other subphases of the gait cycle. Okay. In stance and then in swing. Okay. By the way, at the end, I will leave this presentation for Dr. Negm. For anyone interested to get it, it's fine. Okay, so now we just got a brief about the normal or standard gait pattern. So now we will talk a little bit about the gait with pathology. And I prefer this kind of term rather than using term of pathological gait. Because if we are talking that we have a gait deviation or gait with pathology, so that including the prime impairment, secondary impairment, as well as the compensatory mechanism for the patient. So one of the very famous gait pattern, let's say, especially we can note it in the children with disability or cerebral palsy, is the crouch pattern, okay, in which we have an excessive knee flexion during the stance. So in this picture we have illustrated figures for 4 patients, let's say, and all of them had a sort of crouch pattern. So just to write in your report that your patient had a crouch, full stop, this is not an indication for the whole scenario. So you need to talk with me much more in details about the magnitude, about the performance of each joint. Okay, I know the title very well, but inside this picture, including 4 patients with a crouch. So if you are refer a patient for a surgeon, let's say, or for your colleague, and you are just nominated, this is a crouch, which one of them you are me? Okay, so we are not concerning just with the term. بلاش نبقى دايما في قوالب المسمى ونسكت. احنا محتاجين ان احنا ندخل بتفاصيل اكتر شويه لان كل حاله هتختلف عن الثانيه even if we are under the same title. This is sort of the graphs that we usually obtain from the 3D gait laboratory. The graph, this one represented the hip flexion extension, and you can see that this shadow represents the norm, while the left color represents the left side, the red color is the left side, while the green color represents the right side. This horizontal bar represents the gait cycle, which is 100%. You remember that the stance represents around 60%. So once you have this vertical line, so on the left side, this is the stance. And this side is the swing. Okay? So now I can see that the right and left hips during the gait a little almost near from the north. The standard deviation is still not significant. This is the knee flexion extension. And here we can note that the flexion extension of the knees are below the norm during that time of the gait. While for the ankle, dorsiplantar flexion almost look like normal. So if I'm using the term of pathological gait, هقول ان المريض ده definite عنده مشكله لان هو عنده انحراف واضح والرايت والليفت نيز عنده فيهم مشكله لان هم اقل من ايه؟ اقل من الطبيعي. However, I know this guy very well. Okay? These data belong to me. يعني الرسومات دي بتاعتي انا. وانا على حد علمي ان انا ما عنديش مشكله في ركبي يعني فظيعه. اوكي؟ يعني الحاجات اللي ايه المعتاده شويه يعني طرقعه مش عارف ايه يعني الحاجات المعتاده بتاعتنا as a physics يعني. Like I don't have a dramatic pathology in my knees. So I have to say that to which extent I am a bit conservative during my walking. So the range of motion for my knees is a little less than the norm at the beginning of the gait cycle. However, the rest of that is pretty fine. So the conclusion that مش كل deviation يعتبر pathology أو يعتبر abnormal. We need to understand that we have 2 main terms important to understand. Normal gait, which is pretty nice in the theory and text, and functional gait. So here, this is an example about the functional gait. A little bit, I am shifted from the norm, but it's not that significant, okay? So there is no need for any sort of intervention here. So the gait deviation, like we see this girl, she are assuming a sort of standing over the toes. She has an equinus, slight knee flexion, left more than the right, a little obliquity of the pelvis, as well as the trunk leaning. So usually we are classify the gait deviation into the prime and secondary, major and minor. مش كل المشاكل بتبقى كلها أساسية أو برايم، ومش كلها بتبقى مستصغرة أو secondary أو minor. So she is the same girl, and as you see, she has the capability to walk. She is a cerebral palsy, paraplegic, almost 5 years, and she has an aggressive anterior pelvic tilting during the walking. And this excessive anterior pelvic tilting compensated with a severe lordosis. So this is the first point. So the lordosis considered as a compensatory mechanism. So in case that you are started to correct the anterior tibial, sorry, the pelvic anterior tilting, so you will find that automatically the lordosis will going to be less. So now I need to understand what is the pathology, why she is assuming walking by this way. At that time, we need to go for the evidence-based. So you need to read much more about these similar conditions. الارتكلز والناس اللي اشتغلوا في الابحاث ما اشتغلوش في الابحاث عشان يحطوها على الرف. اشتغلوا في الابحاث عشان يخدمونا احنا as a clinician او as a academic او ايا كان. تمام؟ So it's in an easy way. حاول دايما ان الريفرنس بتاعك ما يبقاش شخص. مع كامل احترامنا وتقديرنا لكل الناس. لكن احنا مش بنتكلم في قرآن. تمام؟ احنا بنتكلم في مواد علمية إنسانية قابلة للصواب والخطأ. So try as much as you can to catch an evidence for that. So if we go for this article, it was pretty new in 2015 in Gait and Posture, and they titled about what is the functional impairment that are the main contributor for the pelvic anterior tilting during walking with an individual with cerebral palsy. So I think this article is much excellent for this girl. So what they said in this article, they said in this article there are several factors postulated for the pelvic anterior tilting. Like what? Hamstring weakness, lengthening of the hamstring, rectus spasticity as well as the iliopsoas, and to other extent the weakness of the trunk muscles. So this is all are hypothesized factors. حاجات قبل ما يعملوا الدراسة جمعوها من أبحاث أخرى وشافوا إن هي عوامل رئيسية تؤدي إلى الانتيريور pelvic tilting. What they found that initially يمكن كتير من الزملاء يبدأوا يتخيلوا if we have a sort of anterior pelvic tilting, so the iliopsoas had a role, let's say, in these issues. But what they found here, clinical-wise, that there is no relation between the tightness and spasticity of the iliopsoas over the anterior pelvic tilting. So they are exclude one of the factors. This is the benefit for the evidence-based. What they found that the increasing in the anterior pelvic tilting is related to the coming factors, related to the spasticity of the rectus femoris, weakness of the main mechanism for the hip extension, which is the gluteus maximus, and then disproportion between the hamstring and the quadriceps. So if you have a weak hamstring and you have a weak gluteus maximus, so the whole mechanism for the hip extensor are diminished. In the other way, you have now spasticity over the rectus and the muscle power of the quad in general a little bit more than the hamstring. So all of that will lead to the anterior pelvic tilting. So now you have the reasons, and now you can handle the main prime factors. Another tip from this article was related directly for the surgeons, orthopedic surgeons, that they said that the underlying that it's of the major importance to consider the hamstring length when planning the hamstring lengthening surgery. Why? Because increasing anterior pelvic tilting is a commonly reported after the hamstring lengthening. يعني هما اتفضلوا الناس اللي عايزه تدخل. إذا هم لقوا إن كتير من جراحين العظام بعد حالات إطالة الهامسترنج بيصاحب ليها anterior pelvic tilt. So they recommend for the surgeons that they have to be very cautious.
خلاص يا بس شكري شكرا لحد الوصل.
So as a conclusion for this article, here we can understand that from the clinical gait analysis, we understand the reasons. We got a tip for the procedure coming for the surgery. And I can add another point. For the people are working here with a spastic hamstring mainly, and they decide to go for the Botox injection. It's the same scenario again and the same concept. You need to understand very well if the hamstring is weak already and you are going to weaken it more with the Botox, so we can imagine that we will catch this issue of the anterior pelvic tilt. That doesn't mean we will make an X over the injection of the hamstring. But again, from your clinical assessment as well as the gait, you can have now clear overview about on which base I'm going to decide my treatment plan and treatment strategy. Another point we need to consider coming from the gait, that if you saw this child walking with a knee flexion during the stance, and here we can find that there is a plus. So it means that we have excessive knee flexion now clear during the stance. So this is one of the pathological condition or abnormality. On the other side, however, we have more flexion for this patient, and okay. Now you can see that the degrees of the flexion of the knees are really higher in relation to the previous patient. So I can say here that this patient has again plus. So it's important not only to identify the deviation, but also to identify the magnitude. Okay, this is another important point, will help you during your design for the treatment plan. I think this will be almost the end because I got almost my time. This is related to the importance of timing when you are going to talk about the clinical gait analysis. So for this graph, this is consists for the ankle dorsiplantar flexion during the gait. And we know that this shadow is the norm, as we mentioned. For the right ankle joint now, it was pretty nice for the equinus or plantar flexion for push-off. And then in a swing, you know that we need to recall the plantar flexion into dorsiflexion. And that happened very nice for the left side. But what we can see here, for the right side, it's going in the direction of the dorsiflexion, but up to this point and then plateau. It doesn't get to the zero position or over the zero. So that means that the performance of the right ankle dorsiflexion was nice, but not through the full range. If we need to correlate between this kinematic and the dynamic electromyography, this shahbata di, okay, for the gastrocnemius during the walking, and here we can see that the gastrocnemius is almost silent during this part of the swing. But at the end of the swing, there is a sort of activity for the gastrocnemius. However, normally, if I need to move like that, so this is the action of the tip anterior, not the action of the gastrocnemius. So in the next graph, we will see the activation of the tip anterior, which is working pretty nice at the early and the mid of the swing. But at the end of the swing, it doesn't work. So now I can correlate for my patient that during swing, they started to make a dorsiflexion, but at the end of the swing, they couldn't continue. The tib anterior couldn't keep working, and the gastrocnemius started to contract. So, if you remember in a good way the anatomy, that the gastrocnemius is biarticular muscle. And if you need to lengthen the gastrocnemius, you need to go for the knee extension and dorsiflexion. So if you have spasticity in this muscle, you will not have the capability to elongate it to that extent. So what we can understand here, that the patient tried to make a dorsiflexion, but at the end of the range, because the knee started to be extended before landing, the gastrocnemius couldn't be silent and start to show a sort of spasticity. So it overcome the activity of the tib anterior. And for this reason, the patient cannot continue the dorsiflexion at the end of the swing. So this is another benefit or the meaning for the impact of the clinical gait analysis on your understanding well why your patient performed the walking by this way. And here I can say that definitely the decision making will be related to the tonal issue of the gastrocnemius to reduce its activity during the full length position for the patient. So try to describe in the conclusion the deviation. You need to understand what is the underlying cause, how it affects the walking, to which extent you will decide your clinical intervention now, and finally, if you are follow all of these points, now you have an efficient and significant rule for the clinical gait analysis over the management. Just at the end, we need to clarify well, is your patient assuming functional walking or great gait with disability? And now you can conclude that the clinical gait analysis is helping you to identify the prime deviation as well as the compensatory to help you for the decision making, either for the surgery, for the orthosis, for the injection, for the medication, as well as for the therapy program. And another important point, it's important for the outcome measures to check about the efficiency of the treatment strategy. شكرا جدا حضرتك.
تنتج أو تصور إعلانات،
خدمات طبية وفندقية على أعلى،
فعاليات ومؤتمرات،
توليد بالدقائق،
فيديو كليبس، جرافيك، برامج تلفزيونية، تسجيلات صوتية ومرئية، تسويق البرامج والإعلانات مع شركة الشريف ميديا لاين. الرؤية الإخراجية بلمسة فنية. الشريف ميديا لاين، أسعار تشجيعية وتنافسية، سرعة الإنجاز وأفضل الأعمال، خبرات متميزة في الكادر المهني مع أقوى الشركات. للتواصل الاتصال على